Hey everybody, it's Ben Callahan from Sparkbox and the Question and Redwoods community, and I have my good friend Erin Potter with me today. We yesterday did the deep dive for episode 63, where Erin was my co-host. Erin, thank you so much for hopping back on today to talk about some of the things we learned.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It was a fun conversation.
It really was. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to sort of hearing from you what you took away from our deep dive with the whole community. So, let me just introduce the topic. You and I had been speaking the week before about this challenge of, most organizations, when they get into doing systems work, they discover that they have many systems already kind of blooming in weird places in the org, right? So when you sort of finally acknowledge that that's the reality that most organizations are dealing with, you kind of have to put your hands around this idea of how do we get these systems to play nicely together, or which ones should exist, which ones shouldn't, right? And then at the end of the day, as we start to hone in on the idea of a core system that is sort of a global, sort of corporate wide, part of the organization's plan, that probably tends to sort of like scale back in some ways. And that means there's space for these other systems to emerge in really healthy ways. And once you get there, you end up with that architecture supporting a system of systems. And now you've got to start dealing with the agreement between those, right? What's the ownership? What is the RACI that's in play with those? What is the contract between them, essentially? And so that's the topic that, as we were talking the week before, we really kind of honed in on as like something we haven't seen a lot of material about, and something that maybe as a community we should explore further. So I'm excited that you brought this topic. I think it was a very productive conversation. I learned a lot. And so let me just recap kind of what we actually asked people. If you're a regular on the Question, you know that we provide a little bit of context as well. So I gave you some of the backstory. And then we asked 3 questions of the community. We asked, does your design system architecture allow for extension systems? And then if it does, the second question was, do you have a defined contract between your core system and those extension systems? And then we asked a more open-ended third question, and that was, what should be included in a contract or an agreement between a core and an extension system? And so we really were just trying to get an understanding of like what's the current state of systems in terms of architecture and in terms of these contracts, and then a little bit open, just tell us what you think should be included in that. So I really like how we framed this up. We sent this out to almost 1,000 people, 996 recipients of that email. We got 52 responses, and wherever you're watching this, there will be a link to the raw data, so you can go take a peek at that yourself. And since we've already done the deep dive, I'll also include a link to the FigJam file, which is what I'm showing you on screen here, and that's where we kind of took notes as a community. So the first 2 questions were a little bit more quantitative. And so let me just kind of quickly cover these, and then we can get into the things that we learned. So the first one, again, was, does your system architecture allow for extension? And if you just look at the raw data answers, the yeses, the nos, there's about half of the people who answered said that their system is sort of set up to enable this kind of working. But as you know, Erin, like when we started looking a little deeper into the other answers, which was quite a few, about a third of the people said other, we got a lot of more gray than just a straight up yes and no. And so we counted a little bit more. We dove in, and I tried to recap a little bit of what I meant by yes and yes-ish. And no-ish. But honestly, this was a question I think it was hard for people to answer directly. And so while a lot of people feel their systems are set up for this kind of approach, there's still a lot of ish there, right? So people said things like, it allows for it, but we as an organization haven't really explored it because of X, Y, Z, or it's complicated, or even people said yes-ish, or I'm unsure, or not yet, or it's too TBD, right? So there's a lot of sort of him-hawing a little bit about whether this was an architecture that was actually in use for them. So the revised data there looks like about 62% said, yeah, it's kind of set up for that. About 30% said no. And then 4%, 8% or so split between it's planned or I just don't know. Was there anything unusual in that data for you, Erin, or was that kind of what you expected? I don't know what I really was thinking going into this. What we would get? What was your expectation?
Yeah, I felt really uncertain. I do know that the Question has folks from different sized organizations. So I recognize a smaller organization may not have the need for a system of systems. So I thought maybe that would maybe polarize the answers as sort of depending who was attending. But I was shocked and interested about the ish and that
Yeah,
it's sort of there, not totally there. The ish was interesting.
that's actually a really good point. The variety of contexts that we're coming to this from. The second question was, if they said yes, do you have a defined contract between those systems? And so only about a very small number said yes to this. So that was, I think, maybe for me, a little bit of confirmation that this is a really important topic for us to be discussing. People really are not, articulating this agreement well. Is that kind of what you expected to?
Yeah, I'm always curious. I know where we're at as an organization. So you're always curious. When you read articles, it sort of sounds like everyone has everything figured out. But when you actually talk to the community, you realize a lot more people are in the same boat of trying to figure it out. So it's on one hand reaffirming, and then you can work together on it. But I think I did maybe hope there were more answers out there,
Yeah.
but we did learn a lot of really cool tidbits that I think can help inform other people in the same boat. I know it's informing our decisions. So,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess, kind of you go in being hopeful that somebody's going to come with all the answers for
yes.
you, but it's never quite that way. So, yeah. Another interesting insight when we looked at these two questions together. So, only the way I'll just read this statement and we can kind of unpack it a little bit. But the statement is that only 22% of the respondents who answered yes to that first question, so those are the people who said their architecture does allow for extension. So of those folks, only 22% reported having a defined contract. And so that's a pretty low percentage, especially in orgs, like large orgs where there are many systems. That means there's a lot of sort of like Wild West just stuff happening. And that creates all kinds of tension, and all kinds of problems. And some of that stuff, I think, for you, Erin, was the root cause of why this question really surfaced for us. So if it's okay, I'd love to have you just give a little bit of your context and why this question was important to you.
Sure. Yeah. At our organization, we do have a number of systems that have spun up over the years for very valid and real reasons. Our core system, the enterprise system that I work on, is now at a level of maturity that we're really hoping we can truly service the enterprise at the token foundation atomic level. And we'd like to formalize relationships with the other systems. So, not trying to shut them down or replace them, but actually coordinate with them so we can actually provide a broader set of components, patterns, et cetera, for our users. So hopefully if we're coordinated, we actually do so much more for our community. So a lot of things that happened organically, we're now at a place that we probably need to put form to it so that people know that they're using the official system, that they know it's been through the proper accessibility channels and things like that. So we're in the state where we're trying to bring people together, but we want to figure out how we do that without, you mentioned the word tension. That's what I think about. Like when things are Wild West, people step on each other's toes more, and that's not what we want. We want to work together and be considerate. So I think sometimes putting boundaries helps that. So I think
Yeah.
that's where I was coming from for the conversation to see how do we do this? How do we respect each other's boundaries, work well together? Um, what do we owe the consuming community, and what do they owe back
Yeah.
to the enterprise system?
Yeah. That's such a good little bit of context for us to have as we kind of dive into this. It's funny because at this point, I feel like I know you pretty well, Erin, and I heard a little bit of idealism in your explanation there of your current context, right? Like I know you well enough to know you really do actually truly want strong relationships with these other teams. You're not trying to like squash everybody and just take everybody under your wings, So I'm wondering, like, I remember the idea of idealism coming up a few times in our conversation on Thursday. So, what is your perspective here? Like, are we just sort of like, as systems people, we're just stuck with this idealism? Is that part of who we are, or like, what's happening in that, you know?
Yeah, it does seem to be a common personality trait, I feel like.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's why maybe we all got into making something for our fellow like associates. Yeah, I know we've done a lot of what, we like to call sort of handshake agreements in the past, but when it gets down into the weeds of how things operate for our customers and not to break things with new versions, it starts to get really tactical and really challenging to manage through sort of a verbal agreement. And I think people do have good intentions. I assume that, but we all have different maybe lines of business or leadership that has different
Right.
priorities that can cause conflicts. And so when we started talking about the word contract, which I know I need to take out of my vocabulary, um, we just we're trying to work on those details to make sure we were all like checking the boxes for our leadership, but also providing our customers the right thing. Anyway, I do feel like there was a big trend in the group around ish that there were verbal agreements and they hadn't gotten to the point of wanting or needing or maybe accepting that maybe something more formal was necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that our, idealism as systems thinkers sometimes maybe leads us to trust that we don't have to articulate things as clearly in terms of like this sort of a contractual or this sort of agreement. So it's funny because that even kind of got us into like some of the people in there. I remember one answer in particular said, am I naive to think that if I just build the core system perfectly, we don't need a contract with these extensions? And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I wish that wasn't true, but I think that is a little bit naive. Like I don't want to be critical of whoever asked that. I think it's a very valid question, but it's one that as systems people, I think we fall into a lot. And so that brings us to this idea of language, right? Because in the way we phrased the question, so there were 2 points I think of language that kept coming up in the convo. One was that the way we phrased the question used the word contract. And the word contract, I think to most of us who are we just want to make stuff, we're not legal people. It means legalese. It means like very solid agreement. It means I'm signing on the dotted line. And so I think there was a lot of pushback. Like many people on the conversation on Thursday kept saying, oh my gosh, contract is such a strong word. It gives me, makes me nervous to even think about using that word. But I just kind of wanted to hear your take on that part of the language conversation. Then we can talk about part 2 of language.
Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't expect it when we like drafted the wording for the question, and then it
Right.
ended up being a big theme throughout. And it was the word contract being very, like that harsh, maybe. And the idea that a lot of people have sort of verbal agreements versus things in writing, I think goes hand in hand, that we tend to like not want to do these really hardline tactics. Um, So I keep thinking about what other language would work in that we can align on how we work, which how we work, I think, was something that people talked about as sort of working together between the systems to say, this is how we work together. These are the agreements and assumptions we're making. So I really liked that concept of that's truly what we're trying to get at, not actually asking for anyone to sign in blood.
Yeah.
But I do want to, you know, uh, make a commitment to say we'll only break the system X number of times a year
Yeah.
and vice versa. So, but I was fascinated how many different ideas around language and wording for what this is called came up.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely like a through line for sure in Thursday's deep dive. There were people who said things like, if it's guidelines, maybe, is it if it's a contract, that implies there's some negotiations possible. At a minimum, we need, who's allowed to publish things, who's allowed to commit to the core versus the extension. So there are like, there's a lot that comes with this language. I think one of the things that I think about often is that, you know, when you're just like if we step out of systems for a minute, like when you sign a contract with somebody, no matter what it's for, the hope is you sign it and you never have to go get it out again, right? Like the moment you pull it out, that means one of you thinks somebody's broken the contract, and we're going back to look and see, what did I commit to? So like in a sense, it's almost like the sort of like very baseline expectation is like, okay, all these things that we know we don't want to have happen in our relationship, we're going to document and say they shouldn't happen. And then we're going to go do the thing, and hopefully we never have to come back to that, like but it does give a moment of alignment, which I think is really, really necessary. So agreement, alignment, contract, I actually don't dislike the word contract because I think it brings a formality to the relationship that's probably necessary. So I don't know, maybe we're on different sides of this one here, but um, important stuff, for sure to work through.
Yes.
So the other side of the language thing, other than just the word contract, was that this sort of challenge around naming of systems. Can you say a little bit more about what that conversation was?
Yeah, sure. For our personal experience, we have a branded name for our core system, and there have been a number of subsystems that have leveraged that naming. Um, and what's interesting about that is it's, really complementary in a lot of ways. They did it for different reasons, and I think that was interesting as well. Some thought it lended some credibility to their system to be tied to what was slated as the enterprise core system. And others did it with an intention that they were eventually going to converge or merge together. Um, However, what we found is some actually inherit our tokens, foundations, and atoms. Some do not. Some are an actual duplication of our system. And so when it has the same name, we see several things happen. One, and then probably the most important, is customers aren't sure who to go to for support. They just see that core name and come to us, but we didn't make that other one.
Yep.
And the other thing that happens is when there's issues or concerns or questions or even requests, like if someone else maybe doesn't uphold those, it gets reflected on the main system. So we have things like NPS surveys and customer feedback, and we get a lot of feedback for systems that we don't own. And so it just makes things a little bit tricky. But I did think it was interesting that a lot of folks had opposing views on naming as to whether they should like extend the core system name or stay away from that.
Yeah.
So,
It feels like there's a pretty convincing list of pros and cons for both approaches. And like when I think about like just boiling it down, the risk that you described of extensions systems not adhering to the service agreements or support agreements that you've identified that you do at the core level. They're using your name, perhaps not even using your system in and of itself. They're getting all this benefit from that because you've done the work to put communication in place and support in place and all of those other things. So that's a weird place to be. But the risk to you in my mind is like, well, if your primary focus now is essentially enabling extension systems, then what is adoption for you? Like how do you get credit for the work that you've done that an extension system has taken and modified that is now living in the product, right? So like there's a further disconnection from the actual impact in product, when it's not connected to you. So I mean, I don't know. It's pros and cons both ways, right? And I think it maybe is this might be one of those moments where it's like, it sort of depends on the culture, on the players, on the organizational structure to sort of figure out what makes sense in each context.
Yeah, yeah, we've like that. Some of the different opinions are, using the same name at least creates sort of a halo effect, a branding consistency, so people do know. And again, if you have that contract in place, and those are the only ones that are actually using the name.
Yeah.
So it has to be maybe a polite asking of others to give the name back, but there's a lot of positivity there. But yeah, I from day to day, I feel like I'm waffling back and
Yeah.
forth about what the right answer is. And the other thing that came up that was really interesting um, is the name the problem or is the support model the problem? We have some where the support model is really clear, so users go directly to the localized system. They know that. We don't get a lot of questions about their really particular product needs. And so somehow they really master that communication to come to the localized system first. If you need to innovate or get to an atomic level, go to the core system. But trust us, we're inheriting the core system. You should just be able to come to us. And then others where we actually get that confusion where so many people come to us with product questions and we are not the best people to answer that specific product's question.
Yeah.
So there's some sort of like disconnect in support and communication that maybe that's really the problem we're trying to solve versus naming.
Yeah. That's a really good sort of nuanced view of the problem space, I think. And then, of course, there's the whole other side to this, which is the optics of the naming. One of the things I think you heard or you expressed to me in our first conversation is that, like leadership would prefer you have one system. And yet when you change the names of the extension systems, then it appears like the optics of that are we have many systems. And that's not sort of meeting your mandate. So how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, it's funny. We actually I had a slide that I was sort of circulating, and it was around, should we call it a system of systems or an ecosystem? Like, so it feels like one cohesive thing, even though they're really the same thing,
Right.
right? But I would say that ecosystem tested so much higher around leadership that I realized that there's something there and we need to pay attention to it and care for it. So I think that's where a lot of the rest of the team has come to let's keep the name, let's solve the other problem. But yeah, and then it was interesting yesterday hearing from a couple of people who were vehemently against using the core name and have experienced sort of what that was like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it goes back
Yeah.
to the probably org by org
Yeah,
situation.
I think so. And that you're right. I do remember that specific part of the conversation where we had somebody who has been through this and has suffered from, the name being sort of almost abused in certain ways, not obviously intentionally, but like just the results of the name being the same created all kinds of problems for them. So, I think regardless, one of the takeaways that I came away with was if you're going to have a system of systems, you need somebody to manage that program, that sort of concept of distribution of systems. So that was, I think, a big takeaway for me, especially. You got to have somebody there who's overseeing that relationship, those agreements, ensuring those agreements are being met.
That's a lot
So
of work. There's a
it
lot of
is. Yeah.
details, a lot of people navigating. So it's
Yeah.
definitely a role into itself, I feel like.
I think so. Yeah. Okay, so we've kind of beat around this whole thing a little bit. Let's talk nuts and bolts of like what should be in an agreement. Okay, so I kind of looked through the data and had some AI assistance, to be honest, about how we might kind of like consolidate the answers. Because when we do that open text kind of thing, we get all kinds of different words meaning very similar things, and it's helpful to kind of try and bring those together in some meaningful way. So I made this list here of the most mentioned themes to the question 3, which was, again, when we asked people just with an open text, what should be in that agreement? And so we got all kinds of stuff. And I want to look at this through the lens of bidirectionality. Like one of the things that we talked about is this is not just us as a core system dictating to extension systems how they should work. There's a give and take here. There's a back and forth. And so if we could kind of like, I don't know, I know you can see this list on your screen too. Like what of these ideas, like how does that sort of commitment that we both are agreeing to give and take filter into any of these specific ideas? So there's boundaries and scope, what's in the core versus what's not. There's design language tokens. Like, of course, we want our extension systems, if they're going to be that, to actually extend the system, not make their own stuff up. There was the idea of quality and accessibility and standards and like a definition of done. Then we got into things like contribution and ownership and governance and change management and all of that sort of stuff. So which of these kind of, to you, Erin, seem like ones that are really critical for that bi-directionality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot about we've been very focused on just delivering our baseline set of components, but we haven't done the best job thinking about when we iterate, how are we communicating that to the folks that are consuming? Are we on a regular schedule so that they can predict when changes are coming? And the other thing is that we haven't been able to get terribly far ahead on our road mapping, or it's changing a lot. We've just had a lot of changes. And so in terms of planning and knowing what components they need or rely on, maybe we aren't meeting their need. But that to me is something that the core system really owes the localized systems. And I think about coming back, it's thinking, how do we elevate ideal patterns or components that can come up to enterprise, because we've tested them, we've proved that they're really successful and that more people need them. The other thing is, I know we feel really passionately about accessibility. And so our core team, everyone gets trained to be an accessibility team trusted partner.
Mm,
And so it actually helps us get through the review process quicker. And we've learned a ton. So there's sort of that expectation that both of us would bring that to the table and have the requirement. So those are the things I think a lot about. And the other one is maintenance of the libraries or code repos and making sure that someone once coined the term like zombie libraries don't show up, meaning they get abandoned. And
yeah.
so the users are sort of disappointed and left hanging. So we want to make sure that we have something in place and a commitment from leadership across these teams to say, if we build it, we will continue to maintain it, or we'll make a plan to converge people.
Yeah.
So those are the ones that like hit home for me.
Yeah, I think those are the right ones. Those are the ones that were sticking out to me as well, especially the versioning, like it's like if we commit as a core system to sort of updating quarterly or something in our versioning or whatever our cadence is, major versions, that also means we need to sort of see those extension systems committing to updating to later versions. And then that gives both of us a little bit of give and take. And it means we don't, as the core system, don't have to continue to support really old versions if we can get consistent upgrading happening at the extension level. So I think that's interesting. The other thing that just kept coming to my mind as you were talking through that is how this approach, this architecture almost changes who your core user is at the core system level. Like, if you don't have extension systems, your primary user are the consumers of the core system. And that is product teams making stuff for users, right? For the end users. And so when you put this extension layer in between, are you saying people should only consume the extension systems to build their products? Or are they going to consume the extension and some of the core? And like, do you now have two audiences? One is system teams making extension systems, and one is product teams making product? Or do you only the extension teams? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, gosh, you're hitting a real like point that we're dealing with. Yeah, no, it's interesting because if I think about it, the core system, if we had users from across the entire org, which is fairly big, coming direct to us, it gets hard to manage. Our backlog is quite large, and it's really hard for us to review and evaluate the needs because we aren't as in-depthly knowledgeable about the product. So there's a little bit of relief thinking about if these localized systems could manage some of those initial requests because they know the product and whether that's a valid request, or maybe it could be handled a different way, or this is the pattern that everyone uses in this particular product. That would be awesome. But, there's the tension of we don't want to lose touch with the end users. We don't
Right.
want to kind of go into a little cubby hole and put little walls around us and only certain people can come in. So we do predict that there will always be some teams that have to consume our library directly because they may be small, they may not have a localized system yet that's the right fit, or maybe they don't need as much.
Yeah.
So I think that we'll kind of always have both, but it is an interesting pull around that. And I know we have some teams that feel really strongly about we want them to come to local first. We
Yeah.
really don't want them going to you unless we've sort of validated that, hey, it is something that needs to be done at the enterprise global level.
Yeah. So interesting. It's
Yeah.
so much nuance here. Like there's a lot to unpack. One other cool observation that we had, since we're talking a little bit about this, is that I think in looking through those answers, we did some correlation back to the first two questions. And so here, I'll just try to state this clearly, and then we can have a quick conversation about it. But in the answers to question 3, we saw that the teams who responded that don't have a clear contract, the things that they said should be in that contract were things like scope and tokens and quality standards, right? Sort of kind of like the basic stuff that you would expect. But the organizations that did have clear contracts already defined, they focused a lot more in their question 3 answers on the relationships between the teams, things like contribution and change management and support. And so there's almost like this, I don't know what this is exactly, maybe like a maturity factor here too. Is that something that you think plays into this?
It seemed like it the more I was reading this and kind of digging through people's responses, and it wasn't something I'd thought about previously. Again, to speak from our experience, our predecessors on the team had the wisdom to form a coalition. So we had the more organic handshake agreement, and we've had that for a couple of years. And I think because we're at the place where there's a lot in these libraries now, we're to the tactical, and probably why we came into this question around contract, that we're like, oh, there's some painful things we've learned. So like, let's button it up. So it did seem like, an evolution of like, hey, first let's just get an agreement. We're working together. And then, oh, snap, we better figure out versioning and releases and all that.
Yeah, I think perhaps it may be like the idea that it kind of gives you some baby steps to take first, and then sort of you can go deeper into that agreement as you kind of explore it together. So that might be a good way to approach it. I did, just as a fun exercise, I anonymized the answers that we got, and I dropped them into ChatGPT, and I asked it to make an actual contract for us, just so we could kind of see it laid out in that format. And so, I'm not necessarily suggesting people would want to use this directly, but it does do a nice job of kind of breaking out some categories to consider. So wherever you're watching this, you can get into that FigJam file. That'll be a read-only access to you, but you should be able to come in and take a peek at this if you want to see it. But it categorized things as saying like, hey, who is this between a core system and an extension? What's the purpose? Our boundaries, our responsibilities, our patterns. And then it had categories of like purpose and scope, shared principles, boundaries, what's core, what's flexible, roles and responsibilities, and then just a list of actual requirements like feedback and testing and change management and documentation and all that kind of thing. So kind of an interesting way to frame it, maybe something like this could serve as like a base to an agreement that folks would handshake on if we don't want to sign on the dotted line. The only other thing we talked about is we had done some work. My organization, Sparkbox, had done some work with one of our clients around something similar. And I think there's like, we kind of positioned this question in the context of systems, but it's a spectrum of approaches that teams take, right? Some are very much centralized. Some have many systems. Some have a core system and allow product teams to build some stuff on top, but it's not necessarily a whole, extension system. And so all those layers, all those, moments across the spectrum are probably could benefit from this kind of agreement. So this is just again, in the FigJam file, just a model that folks could use to say, hey, at this top sort of production layer, we're that's where that core system lives. This is the stuff that's ready for prod. You can use it today. It's secure, it's safe, it's fast, it's accessible, all that. And then maybe there's a low level of experimentation. And that's, I think some people in the answers talked about playgrounds or sandboxes, and that's just a place where all the product teams can come together using those core elements and experiment with stuff, make new things. And then from there, things can be nominated into a validation layer. And that might be things that product teams actually use, but it's not been made systematic in terms of like global sort of enterprise-wide system. So it's good enough to serve them and their product needs, but not made for use across any product. And so then you have this sort of path, that things can follow, right? An idea can start down in this purple layer, can move into this validation layer, and then can be hardened into something if it's appropriate for the core system. So again, this is one specific example. I think thinking about things in this way of like, how does an idea start that's more innovative and make its way into a standardized approach like a core system would offer. So anyway, not necessarily a direct application, but something that might be useful for folks who are in this space as well.
Yeah, it feels super relevant when you talk about these layers of systems around. And what I like about this is just creating visibility. I think
Yeah.
when you have disconnected systems, you just don't get to see the goodness that other people are making. And I like, again, a lot of people mention sandboxes or playgrounds, like you said. It's just a place where people can at least see what other teams have so that they may not have to build it. Like whatever we can do to avoid duplication is a win in my mind. So I love this idea of finding ways to say, hey, it's out there. People can test it, see it, try it out, see if they like it, before it's like heavily maintained, before it's heavily processed to go to the enterprise systems. We can test before it moves up. So I feel like this is such a nice tangential like thing to keep in mind when you
Yeah.
have the system of systems.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of things to be thinking about and to have a process where that findability is there, and like, honestly, if we step away from all the assets we make and all the stuff that we do as systems people, what we really want is our teams to reuse things, to not have to solve the same problems over and over. So frankly, I don't really care how they do that. And if this lets them do that without us having to build assets for everything, then that's great. I think there's a lot of value in this kind of stuff, this way of thinking. That was it. And we covered a ton. I feel like this was a long recap, but it's because there was so much good stuff. And Erin, I just want to say thanks to you again for this is your second time co-hosting. So thanks for coming back, and thanks for bringing such a good energy and a fun conversation for the community.
Yeah, thanks for having me and letting us solve our own problems with the group. And I'm really thankful for everyone who came and shared their insights. I feel like I learned a lot in this one, as I do always with the question. But it's a great community with diverse perspectives to help balance what's happening at anyone's own home organization. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely get you back at some point in the future, Erin. Thanks so much. And everybody, we'll see you at the next one coming up. I think it's not until November. We've got a little break here. So enjoy your couple weeks off, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.